He poured scalding coffee on a quiet black woman and smiled as she trembled in silence. What he didn't know, she had raised the man who could burn his entire career to the ground. In that silent cafe, beneath a faded photo frame, a storm began, and when it broke, no badge in Ridgeway could stop it. Before we continue this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another powerful story you won't want to miss. The Morning Brew Cafe sat quietly on the corner of Willow and 12th. It wasn't the kind of place where scandals began or stories ended. It was a place where life moved slow, where people knew your name but not your secrets. Its sun-faded windows welcomed regulars with the smell of cinnamon and fresh coffee, and for Gloria Hall, it was her sanctuary. She came every Wednesday at 8:15 IE member sharp. Always the same, quiet gray sneakers, a floral scarf tucked neatly beneath a modest gray coat, and a worn leather notebook under her arm. She didn't need fancy lattes or flavored syrups. Just a black coffee, one sugar, no cream. She would sit at the second booth on the left, near the window, the one with the crack in the nook wood. For 3 years, that seat belonged to her. Not because she claimed it loudly, but because no one else dared. Respect in this town wasn't given easily, but Gloria earned it quietly. Most folks in Ridgeway knew her as a retired special education teacher. Some remembered the kindness in her voice when she taught their children how to read. Others recalled the firm but gentle way she corrected bad manners without ever raising her a widow, a grandmother of 4, a woman who mailed birthday cards on time and pressed wildflowers between the pages of old cookbooks. She lived simply, loved deeply, and spoke rarely, but when she did, people listened. That morning was like every other. She nodded politely to the barista, a young woman named Erin who always smiled a little brighter when she saw her. Gloria placed her order without fuss, thanked Erin softly, and made her way to her booth. She set her notebook down first, then her scarf, then finally slid into the booth with a quiet sigh. Outside, the town stirred lazily. Mothers walking strollers, shopkeepers flipping their... Ridgeway was the kind of place where the sun rose a little slower, and the world, though imperfect, tried to pretend it was safe. But safety, like silence, could be deceptive. Because that morning, as Gloria opened her notebook and began to jot down her grocery list, eggs, flour, greeting cards, a shadow passed across the page. It was heavy, deliberate, and unwelcome. She looked up and saw him, Deputy Chad Rowlands. Ridgeway's mistake in a uniform. He wasn't new, but somehow he always carried himself like the town owed him something. A man who played football 3 towns over, flunked out of state college, and wore his badge not as a symbol of service, but as a shortcut to respect. Tall, rawed, and radiating entitlement. Rowlands walked like it was a favor. He liked things in order. His order, and today the second booth by the window wasn't empty. He stood there for a moment, pretending to be polite, adjusting his belt, nodding slightly, but his eyes said otherwise. He wasn't there to share space. He was there to take it. "You mind moving, ma'am?" Rowlands said, voice light but sharp, cutting the quiet like a blade disguised as a smile. Gloria looked up, blinking softly. He smiled wider, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I always sit there." Gloria closed her notebook gently. "I've been sitting here every Wednesday for 3 years." Rowlands glanced around the cafe, his smile curdling. The barista froze behind the counter. A pair of teenagers near the pastry display leaned in, whispering. No one spoke, no one moved. Rowlands hated witnesses, so he smiled again, tighter this time, a smile with no kindness behind it. "Guess it's time someone reminded you how things work around here." And that's when the air changed, not loud, not sudden, but thick and uneasy, like the world held its breath and waited to see what would break first. Gloria didn't flinch. She didn't scowl or fold. She simply set her pen down beside her coffee cup and folded her hands in her lap, calm as morning fog. "I'm sorry, officer," she said softly, "but this seat's taken." For a brief second, You could feel it, that moment where maybe, just maybe, decency would win. Where Rollins might laugh it off and move along. But then you remembered who he was. Rollins wasn't looking for a seat. He was looking for control. His smile thinned into a sneer. He stepped closer, hand resting near his belt. "I don't think you heard me. I said, this is my seat, so why don't you finish up, sweetheart, and find yourself another corner?" The cafe was silent. You could hear the hum of the fridge, the soft clatter of a spoon hitting porcelain somewhere in the back. Gloria gave a single slow breath, steadying her voice, her dignity. "I come here for peace. I won't be moved by arrogance." And that was it. Rollins' grin vanished. The kind of man who wasn't used to being told no, especially not by a black woman, with calm in her voice and history in her eyes. Without warning, he reached for her cup. He lifted it with one hand, slowly, deliberately, as if giving her one last chance to beg. She didn't. Then, with the cruelty of a man who thought no one would stop him, he tilted the cup forward and poured the steaming coffee down the front of her blouse. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't an accident. It was slow, measured, intentional. The hot liquid soaked her scarf, spread across the beige fabric of her blouse, and darkened it instantly. Gloria gasped, but didn't scream. Her body stiffened against the heat, against the shame. Across the room, a fork slipped from someone's hand and hit the floor with a faint clatter. And still Rollins smiled. But Gloria didn't break. She stood, calmly, despite the sting of the coffee, the weight of every eye in the room. She wiped her trembling hands on a napkin, folded it, and set it down gently. Then, with a voice steady as a church bell, she spoke 3 quiet words. "You've made a mistake." The room was frozen. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the air felt still, thick with disbelief. Except for Jaden, 17 years old, sitting by the pastry counter, phone clutched in his trembling hands. He hadn't meant to catch this moment. He was scrolling through his feed, killing time before school. But when he saw that coffee tilt forward, something in him knew. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't harmless. This was history, ugly and alive. And so he hit record. The phone's camera caught it all, the steam rising from Gloria's blouse, the smug tilt of Rollins' chin, and the unbearable quiet that followed. Jaden's hands shook, but he kept the camera steady enough to frame what mattered most. Because just behind Gloria, pinned to the cafe's community bulletin board, was a framed photo. Ridgeway's new police chief. A black man in uniform, smiling softly beneath the words, "Proudly raised by Gloria Hall." The camera caught the stain on her blouse, the cold glint of Rollins' badge. And that photo, framed by sunlight, like a quiet warning, Rollins was too blind to see. Jaden zoomed in slightly, steadying his breath. He whispered under his breath, barely audible on the recording, "Yo, is he serious right now?" That whisper, raw and disbelieving, would later echo across millions of phones worldwide. But in that moment, it was just a kid watching a grown man pour cruelty on a woman who could have been anyone's mother. Gloria gathered her things with slow, practiced grace. She didn't meet Rollins' eyes again. She didn't owe him that. Instead, she turned toward the door, shoulders squared, blouse soaked, leaving behind the cup, the napkin, and the seat that wasn't his to claim. And as the doorbell chimed softly above her, the entire cafe stayed frozen in their seats. Except for Jaden. He stopped recording, lowered his phone, and stared at the badge number on Rollins' chest. He knew, even before the notifications started flooding his screen, that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And out on the corner of Willow and 12th, the wind carried the scent of cinnamon scones and the quiet crackle of a storm about to break. Jaden sat outside the cafe, legs shaking beneath the small wooden bench, where tourists usually took selfies with their coffee. His fingers hovered over his phone, hesitation curling in his stomach like a knot. He could have deleted the video, could have let the moment fade away like so many others, but his thumb hovered over the "post" button, and the words his grandmother used to say echoed in his mind. Silence protects no one. He tapped the screen. The caption was simple. "Racist cop just poured hot coffee on an old lady in my town. Watch this." Within minutes, the notifications started pinging. Likes, shares, shocked comments. Friends from school who barely spoke to him messaged with wide-eyed emojis and "Yo, is this real?" question. Local Ridgeway pages picked it up first. Then a regional account. By 9:43, a Samajari page reposted it with the caption, "Say her name, Gloria Hall." By 10:12 a.m., it hit Twitter. A popular account with hundreds of thousands of followers reposted the clip, adding, "He didn't know whose mother he just humiliated." And by 11:03 a.m., Ridgeway wasn't just a sleepy town anymore. It was trending nationwide. The comments came in waves, some angry, some heartbroken, some asking how this still happens. People wanted answers. Who was this woman? Who was this cop? And what kind of department lets this happen at 8 a.m. in a coffee shop where kids buy muffins before school? Hashtags piled up. Right now, a copycat of right-wing charism, surrender. The footage looped endlessly. Gloria's calm face drenched in coffee. Rollins's smug grin. The framed photo behind her shoulder, proudly raised by Gloria Hall. By noon, local reporters were calling the café non-stop. A local blogger posted a piece titled, "Small Town Big Shame." National outlets scrambled to confirm identities. Unconfirmed reports flooded the web. Retired teacher assaulted in public. Is this the police chief's mother? Small town faces big scandal. But for all the noise outside, inside Gloria Hall's modest home, there was only quiet. She sat in her kitchen, blouse changed, tea cooling beside her, phone silenced. She knew what was coming. The noise, the headlines, the pity. But what mattered most wasn't who saw the video. It was who listened to it. And, in an office across town, Police Chief Marcus Hall was about to listen harder than anyone. Police Chief Marcus Hall was in the middle of a strategic planning session when the storm hit. The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and old ambition. Senior officers sat around the table, dryly discussing patrol schedules and crime statistics, as if Ridgeway was just another sleepy town where problems stayed politely buried under paperwork. Marcus tried to focus, tried to breathe through the monotony, but something in the air felt wrong. Then, his assistant Carla burst through the door without knocking. She never interrupted meetings. "Chief," she said, her voice tight, phone shaking in her hands, "you need to see this." The room froze. Marcus took the phone, the screen already playing the now viral video. The coffee, the booth, his mother's face, the crack in the footage where her blouse darkened in slow motion, her silence. And then, there it was, his own photo in the background, proudly raised by Gloria Hall. His stomach dropped. He watched it once, then again, and the third time, he put the phone down and exhaled slowly, like a man choking on rage that couldn't find its way out of his throat. The room was dead silent. No one dared speak. Marcus adjusted his badge, stood up, and left the meeting without another word. His steps down the hall were steady, but steady. Every officer he passed lowered their gaze. Some had already seen the video. Some were too afraid to ask. Others knew exactly what it meant. By the time he reached his office, the entire precinct felt like it was holding its breath. Marcus closed the door, took one long, measured breath, and made a single call. "Get Deputy Rollins in my office, now." 15 minutes later, Rollins strolled in, chewing gum like it was a lazy Saturday afternoon. "Hey, Chief, You needed me? Something about a report? He was clueless. Clueless to the storm waiting on his doorstep. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam the desk. That wasn't his way. Instead, he slid the phone across the table. Video paused at the exact moment the coffee poured down Gloria's blouse. Explain this. Rollins froze for a second, then forced a laugh. Oh, come on, Chief. That's just. I mean, I didn't know. Marcus cut in, voice razor sharp. That's the problem. You didn't know who she was. And worse, you didn't care who she could have been. Rollins shifted, the room growing smaller around him. She was just, Rollins stammered. I thought she was nobody. Marcus stood slowly, the weight of every badge, every broken promise, settling on his shoulders. It's not nobody, he said coldly. She's my mother. Rollins went pale. Marcus leaned in slightly, his voice steady, controlled. You suspended. Effective immediately. Internal Affairs will investigate. Turn in your badge and weapon by the end of the day. Rollins opened his mouth to protest, but Marcus silenced him with a look. This isn't just about you. This department will answer for every stain like this. Starting today. Rollins left the room, the weight of the world finally catching up to him. And in that silent office, Marcus Hall stared at his reflection in the darkened window, knowing the battle wasn't with one man. It was with a system that let men like him thrive. The news of Rollins' suspension hit the streets before lunchtime. Some thought Marcus would try to cover it up, bury it in bureaucracy like so many other scandals. But by noon, a single line appeared on the Ridgeway Police Department's public bulletin board. Deputy Chad Rollins, suspended pending investigation. No apology, no explanation, just the truth in black and white. But Ridgeway wasn't the kind of town where truth stayed quiet for long. Outside the precinct, the first cup appeared at 12:32 p.m. An old man in overalls and a frayed fishing cap set it down gently on the steps. Black coffee, no sugar, no cream, just like Glory always ordered. Then another. By 1 o'clock there were 5 cups. By 2, 23. A silent protest. No signs, no chants, just cups of coffee lined up like quiet witnesses to a crime no one could ignore anymore. Inside the café, where it all began, the air was thick with whispers and sidelong glances. Regulars filled the booths, but no one sat in Gloria's seat. It remained empty, her notebook and scarf still left behind, a quiet memorial to what had happened just hours before. Reporters gathered outside, cameras angled toward the window, trying to capture the scene. Some locals crossed the street to avoid the spectacle. Others pressed their faces against the glass, searching for answers in the worn wood and faded sunlight. The barista, Erin, wiped down the counter with trembling hands, replaying the moment over and over in her mind. She wished she'd spoken up, wished she'd done something besides freeze. But silence had ruled Ridgeway for far too long. And now, its cracks were showing. Across town, Marcus sat in his office, alone, reviewing Gloria's file. Not her personnel record, her life. Photos from her retirement party, letters from former students, articles about the programs she'd started for special needs kids. How could anyone look at her and not see her worth? But that was the point, wasn't it? For Rollins, for too many others like him, she was invisible. Just another quiet black woman taking up space they thought they owned. Marcus' phone buzzed. Another email from the mayor. Another warning to manage the optics. But Marcus wasn't interested in optics. He was interested in truth. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out into the cold afternoon air. Outside the precinct, a small crowd had gathered. Teachers, students, pastors, shop owners. Some he knew by name, others by face. None of them spoke. They just stood there, hands in their pockets, eyes steady, guarding those coffee cups like sacred ground. Marcus stopped at the top of the steps, looked out at them. and nodded once. No speeches, no cameras. Just acknowledgement. The first crack of change is never loud. It's quiet, measured. But it shakes the ground all the same. The morning after the suspension, Marcus Hall stood in the dim records room of the Ridgeway Police Department. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the rows of file cabinets lining the wall. The room smelled like dust and something colder. Officer Janine Cole, clipboard in hand, flipped through a stack of faded manila folders, her brow furrowed deep. She was one of the few who had stood by Marcus when the department grew silent. Now she stood shoulder to shoulder with him again, sleeves rolled up, ready to face the rot they both knew was buried in these files. "Chief, I've pulled the last 10 years of use of force complaints. 47 cases dismissed with no formal review. 32 flagged for possible bias. 20 of those, same 2 officers attached every time." Marcus felt the numbers hit him like cold rain. They weren't surprising, but they were staggering all the same. "Names?" he asked, voice low. He nodded grimly. "Rollins is on a third of them. But he's not alone. Lieutenant Harlow, Sergeant Void, and more." She handed him a list. A long one. Marcus scanned it, jaw tightening. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern. A culture. And it had been hiding in plain sight. He ran his hand along the edge of a file cabinet, feeling the dust smear beneath his palm. How many times had these complaints been filed away, forgotten? No, not forgotten, ignored. He turned back to Cole. "Start compiling a full report. We audit every complaint, use of force, racial bias, civilian misconduct. I want patterns mapped, incidents cross-referenced. I want the truth." Cole hesitated. "Sir, this is going to blow up the department." Marcus nodded. "It already has. We're just the ones pulling back the curtain." Cole exhaled slowly, then grabbed another box of files. As she worked, Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. An anonymous email, no sender name, no signature. Subject line, "Rollins isn't the only one." Attached were 3 documents, old internal memos, civilian complaint forms that had never been logged into the system. One mentioned a traffic stop where a Latino father was pulled from his car. In front of his children, Rollins and Creel listed as the arresting officers. No body cam footage. No formal write-up. No follow-up. Marcus stared at the screen, heart pounding against the walls of his chest. The rot wasn't new. It was deep. And it was waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to dig it up. The next morning, Marcus Hall found himself face-to-face with the weight of institutional resistance. It came wrapped in a thick envelope stamped with the Ridgeway Police Union seal, delivered not through a conversation, but left, conspicuously, on his desk while he was out retrieving another file. Inside, a single typed letter. "Chief Hall, your recent actions regarding Deputy Rollins and your proposed audit of internal affairs have created a hostile work environment and placed undue stress on departmental morale. We urge you to immediately cease all retroactive investigations or face a formal vote of no confidence from the union membership." The letter ended with 3 signatures, all familiar. Lieutenant Harline, Sergeant Boyd, Corporal Jenkins. Marcus folded the letter slowly, the paper crackling in his hands like dry leaves. He had expected this. He knew the moment he suspended Rollins, the old guard wouldn't sit quietly. They never did. But reading their threats in black and white still cut deeper than he'd admit. The phone on his desk buzzed. A message from Carlo. Carlo 5 requesting comment on Rollins' suspension. Mayor's office says you're escalating tensions. Marcus set the letter down, closing his eyes briefly to gather the fragments of his resolve. Escalating tensions? No. He was just refusing to let them stay buried. A second email came in, anonymous. The subject line read, "Watch your back." No text, just a PDF attachment titled, "Unresolved PDF attachment titled, Uninitiated Complaints." Against his better judgment, he opened it. The file contained summaries of past complaints never filed with the state. Allegations against multiple officers, some still active, some recently retired. Pattern after pattern. Traffic stops gone wrong, witnesses intimidated, footage mysteriously missing, and supervisors signing off on dismissals without proper review. And Rollins' name? It wasn't even the worst one. Corporal Creel had more complaints in the last 5 years than Rollins and Boyd combined. Marcus felt a chill creep down his spine. It wasn't just bad apples. It was the whole orchard. He called Officer Cole into his office, the exhaustion already wearing lines into his face. "I'm going to announce the audit publicly. Full transparency. No more hiding behind closed doors." Cole blinked. "You know what that'll do, right? They'll come for your bags next." Marcus nodded. "They already are. But this isn't about protecting me. It's about protecting whoever walks into a coffee shop tomorrow and doesn't have a camera rolling to save them." Cole bit her lip, hesitated. Then she squared her shoulders. "I'm with you. Let's burn this thing down the right way." The words settled in the air, electric and terrifying. Across town, the pressure was building. Inside Gloria's modest home, the phone rang endlessly. Journalists, activists, curious strangers wanting a quote, a soundbite, a tearful interview. She answered none of them. Instead, she sat by her window, the same notebook resting in her lap, a mug of cold tea by her side. When Marcus stopped by late that evening, worn and hollow-eyed, she didn't greet him with worry or pity. Just quiet understanding. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, head in his hands. "They're coming after me, Ma," he whispered. She folded her hands neatly, watching him through soft but steady eyes. "Truth doesn't shout, son," she said softly, "but it doesn't hide either." Her voice reminded him of childhood nights when the world felt too big and he felt too small. She used to tell him, "Walk upright, even when the ground shakes." And now it was shaking. But he was still standing. Outside, Ridgeway was stirring. Not in chaos, but in quiet defiance. Students at the local college printed flyers, "Hold the line." Pastors prepared Sunday sermons on justice. Business owners put cups of coffee in their windows as silent reminders of what happened when good people look away. And by morning, outside City Hall, a small crowd had gathered. No speeches, no shouting. Just coffee cups lined up on the courthouse steps. A town that had been silent for too long was finally starting to speak. That Sunday morning, long before the church bells rang, Gloria Hall sat by her living room window, watching the sun try to break through the clouds. She still hadn't changed the curtains, still hadn't thrown away the stained blouse that sat folded on the armchair beside her, the fabric stiff with dried coffee and silent defiance. The phone rang again. She let it ring. A knock at the door came next. It was Marcus. He stepped inside, his shoulders carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken battles. He didn't speak right away. He just sat across from her, Stella's on his knees, staring at the floor like a man waiting for the storm to pass. "I didn't want this for you," he said quietly. Gloria's voice was soft but steady. "I didn't want it for you either. But here we are." He looked up, meeting her gaze, searching for something he couldn't name. "Do you ever regret raising me to fight back?" She smiled gently, lines creasing at the corners of her eyes. "Never. I regret the world still needs you, too." The room fell silent, the kind of quiet that feels like prayer. Marcus reached across the table and took her hand. "Truth takes time, baby," Gloria whispered, "but it don't forget." Outside, Ridgeway gathered. Students arrived first, their backpacks slung over one shoulder, hands tucked into jacket pockets. Then the pastors came, their collars crisp beneath worn coats. Business owners, church deacons, single mothers, retired factory workers. One by one they showed up, some carrying coffee cups, others holding nothing but their silence. No podiums, no microphones. Just a line of coffee cups stretching down the courthouse steps like a quiet river. The mayor watched from her office window, her breath fogging the glass. A single teenager approached the steps, bent down, and placed an old ceramic mug, cracked but whole, at the front of the line. It wasn't a protest. It was a reminder of who they were, of what they'd allowed, and of what they refused to accept moving forward. The café where it all began sat quiet across the street. Gloria's booth remained empty, sunlight spilling across the scarred wood. But outside, Ridgeway was no longer silent. It had found its voice in coffee cups, quiet steps, and the steady beat of people who finally refused to look away. The Ridgeway Police Department wasn't silent anymore. It was splintered. In the break room, conversations stopped when Marcus walked in. On the firing range, officers whispered between rounds. In the parking lot, they gathered in small clusters, heads bowed over phones, trading rumors faster than facts. Some stood with him, tired of hiding in the shadows. Others, too afraid or too proud to admit the truth, sharpened their resistance behind closed doors. It wasn't the kind of war with guns or sirens. It was colder than that. The kind of war where people smiled at you in meetings and stabbed your reputation by lunchtime. The first shot came from Captain Harlan. An article hit the local press, unsigned but sourced by a high Hiram department official. It painted Marcus as unstable, power-hungry, accusing him of weaponizing race and personal tragedy to justify a political crusade. The headline read, "Chief Hall's Witch Hunt, Personal Grudge, or Police Reform?" It spread like wildfire through Ridgeway. Talk radio hosts called for Marcus's resignation. Anonymous callers flooded the mayor's office with complaints. A letter to the editor accused Marcus of tearing the department apart to settle old scores. But Marcus stayed silent. Not because he was weak. Because he knew silence, when wielded wisely, makes your next word hit harder. Cole found him reading the article in his office, expression unreadable. "They're coming for you hard," she said softly. Marcus set the paper down. "Let them." Cole hesitated. "They'll turn the town against you." He looked up, his voice flat but steady. "If Ridgeway turns because of a lie, they were never with me to begin with." The door opened. Carlos stepped in, phone in hand. "Mayor Lasker wants to see you, now." Marcus nodded once. "Tell her I'm coming." Across town, the protests grew. Not loud, not violent, just steady. Cups of coffee lined the precinct steps every morning. New faces joined the line each day. School teachers, nurses, auto mechanics, teenage athletes, people who saw something broken and refused to ignore it. But inside the department, cracks deepened. Anonymous notes appeared on Marcus's desk overnight. "Traitor, badge for sale, your mom's seat won't save you." But there were other notes too. Quiet slips of paper slid under his door. Officers who weren't ready to speak publicly, but who wanted him to know, "We're with you. Don't stop. It's time." The fracture lines were clear now. And Marcus knew the real battle was just beginning. Mayor Evelyn Lasker's office sat high above the town square, its tall windows casting long shadows across polished wood and leather-bound books. She didn't waste time on pleasantries when Marcus arrived. She gestured toward the chair across from her desk, but didn't wait for him to sit. "You're losing this department," she said, her voice tight. "And you're taking the city's reputation with it." Marcus met her gaze without flinching. "I'm not losing anything worth keeping, if it protects men like Rollins." The mayor sighed, rubbing her temples. "Marcus, I admire what you're trying to do, but the fallout is bigger than you think. Business leaders are calling. The Chamber of Commerce is panicking. Donors are threatening to pull out of next quarter's public safety budget. The council is restless, and the press, God, the press is circling like sharks. Marcus leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His voice was low, steady. Let me ask you something, Evelyn. If your mother walked into a cafe tomorrow, and someone humiliated her like they did mine, would you be telling me to calm down? The question hung in the air, sharp and personal. The mayor's jaw tightened. This isn't about feelings, Marcus. This is about the city. You swore an oath to protect it. And I am, he said quietly, even if it doesn't want to be protected from itself. She stood and walked to the window, arms crossed over her chest. The town stretched out before her, quiet but restless. Are you prepared to lose your career over this? She asked softly. Marcus didn't hesitate. If I don't stand now, what's the point of the badge? She turned, studying him with something between frustration and reluctant respect. You're a good man, Marcus, but good men don't always survive politics. He stood, straightened his jacket, and looked her in the eye. Then let politics bury me, but I won't bury the truth for politics. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the mayor sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. You've got one shot to clean this up before the council steps in. Do it fast, or they'll do it for you. Marcus nodded once. Understood. As he left her office, the weight of the town pressed against his shoulders. But beneath that weight, something steadier held him up. Conviction. Across town, the coffee cups remained on the steps. Silent reminders that Ridgeway was watching and waiting to see if justice would finally speak. Later that evening, Gloria climbed the narrow stairs of her home, the wooden steps creaking softly beneath her quiet weight. The attic smelled of dust and old stories. She hadn't been up there in years, not since Marcus left for college. But something about the way the town felt today, the way Marcus stood so tall in the storm, sent her searching through the past. She opened an old cedar chest, tucked beneath a faded quilt. Inside were keepsakes of another life, school programs, faded photographs, and a worn manila envelope with Marcus's name written across it in careful script. She pulled it free and sat cross-legged on the attic floor. Inside, she found it. A newspaper clipping from his senior year of college. The headline read, "Student leader arrested during peaceful protest at state capitol." There, beneath the bold letters, was a photo of Marcus, arms raised, defiant but calm, leading a march against racial profiling in the state university police system. She smiled softly, brushing dust from the corner of the page. Even then, her son couldn't stay quiet, when silence was easier. Even then, he walked upright when the ground shook beneath him. She folded the clipping carefully and placed it on the nightstand beside her favorite chair. Down at the station, the storm continued to brew. Officer Nathan Reynolds stood outside Marcus's office door, debating whether to knock. He was young, maybe 28, with 6 years on the force, and a conscience growing heavier by the hour. He'd watched it happen for years, the quiet complaints that disappeared, the body cam footage that never saw the light of day, the way officers like Rollins laughed when no one else was listening. But he'd also watched Marcus. And somewhere between the silence and the truth, Reynolds made his choice. He knocked once, then stepped inside. Marcus looked up, surprised but steady. "Reynolds." The young officer swallowed hard, then pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "Chief, I don't want to get anyone in trouble, but I can't look the other way anymore. I've been keeping track of some of the incidents, complaints that never made it upstairs." He set the paper on Marcus's desk. 7 names, 12 complaints, all quietly dismissed, all tied to the same circle of officers who backed Rollins. Marcus read it silently, then looked up. Now? Reynolds shifted on his feet. Because when I took this badge, I thought I was supposed to protect people, not protect each other from the truth. Marcus leaned back, the weariness in his bones giving way to something lighter. Hope. Thank you, Reynolds. This helps more than you know. Reynolds nodded, his voice low but firm. I just want to be proud of the uniform again, sir. Marcus smiled faintly. So do I. Outside the office, the department stirred. Some officers watched Reynolds leave Marcus's office and turned away in disgust. Others watched him and wondered if maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop whispering in corners and start standing in the light. The next day, Marcus began compiling a full report. The list of names grew longer, the patterns clearer. The deeper he dug, the more he saw it. This wasn't a few bad apples. It was a culture. And Ridgeway wasn't ready for what was coming next. But ready or not, the storm was already here. And Marcus Hall had no intention of sheltering from it. He would walk straight through it, just like his mother taught him. The sun rose over Ridgeway like it always did. Quiet, slow, unbothered. But the town beneath it was holding its breath. At 6:45 a.m. Marcus Hall walked through the front doors of the Ridgeway Police Department, his step steady, his jaw set. In his hands was a single sheet of paper, crisp and undeniable. On it were 7 names. 7 badge numbers. 7 cases under internal review for excessive force, racial bias, and abuse of authority. No rumors, no whispers, just names and facts. He pinned the list to the public bulletin board outside the precinct's main entrance, right beside the American flag and the department's mission statement. Above the list, in bold black marker, he wrote a single sentence. No justice without truth, no trust without transparency. And then he stepped back, tucked his hands into his pockets, and watched the quiet morning unfold. The first civilian stopped at 7:02 a.m., a mother on her way to drop off her kids at school. She paused, read the list, and whispered a single word beneath her breath. By 7:15, a photo of the list hit social media. By 7:45, it was trending statewide. By 9:00, Ridgeway wasn't just a small town anymore. It was a battleground. Talk radio exploded. Half the callers called Marcus a hero. The other half called him a traitor. Cable news anchors debated his leadership in split screens. Is this courage or chaos? One headline asked. Small town chief exposes his own department, bold move or betrayal, another read. Reporters flooded Ridgeway's quiet streets. National networks parked vans outside the police station. Journalists lined the sidewalks, cameras aimed at the entrance like it was a crime scene. Inside the department, the air was colder than the autumn wind. Some officers glared when Marcus passed. Others lowered their eyes in shame. A few offered quiet nods of respect. Marcus didn't slow down. He had made his choice. And Ridgeway would have to make theirs. By noon, national talk shows were debating the same question. Is Chief Hall tearing down the blue wall of silence, or just burning down his own house? The answer wasn't clear. But the town knew one thing for sure. The silence was broken, and there was no putting it back together again. By the afternoon, Ridgeway was no longer just a name on a map. It was a headline on every major network. Journalists crowded the precinct steps, microphones extended like weapons. Some came searching for truth, others came hunting for spectacle. At 1:15, Marcus held a brief press conference. No podium, no prepared speech, just his voice steady against the autumn wind. He said plainly, I authorized the release of those names. No, he continued, I am not ashamed. And then he delivered the line that echoed across the nation. If protecting the public costs me favor with those who hide behind a badge, then I welcome the cost." Some reporters nodded, scribbling furiously. Others rolled their eyes, already drafting hit pieces about a chief too emotional, too radical, too dangerous to lead. Talk shows spun their own versions of the truth. Is this leadership or revenge? Has Chief Hall turned his grief into a political crusade? Will Ridgeway survive this internal war? But Marcus didn't respond to the noise. Because Ridgeway wasn't the only place listening. In cities across the country, small-town police chiefs watched carefully, some fearful, some inspired. The ripple was bigger than Ridgeway. It always had been. But closer to home, the backlash was sharper, more personal. That evening, Marcus found his car vandalized in the precinct parking lot. Across the driver's side door, someone had scratched a single word: traitor. The paint was gouged deep, the letters angry and raw. Marcus stared at it for a long moment, the wind pulling at his coat. Then he opened the trunk, pulled out a rag and a bottle of polish, and began to scrub. It didn't matter who did it. It mattered that they thought this would stop him. And it wouldn't. Officer Cole spotted him from across the lot. She approached quietly, hesitant but steady. "You don't have to clean that yourself," she said softly. Marcus wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve. "Sometimes you clean the damage, even if you didn't cause it." Cole stood beside him in the fading light, the quiet between them heavy but unbroken. "You know they're counting the days until they vote you out," she said. He nodded once. "Let them count." And with that he turned back to his work, polishing away the scars one stroke at a time. He couldn't erase the hate, but he could refuse to wear it. The community forum was held in the basement of St. Mark's Church, a simple room with folding chairs and bad lighting. It wasn't fancy, but it was full. Locals filled every chair, lined the walls, and stood shoulder to shoulder in the back. Teachers, postal workers, retirees, high school students, all waiting for someone to make sense of what was happening in their quiet town. For days, reporters had tried to chase Gloria Hall down. They wanted a soundbite, a tearful interview, a viral moment of vulnerability. She gave them none of that. Until now. At the front of the room, the town council chair cleared his throat and spoke stiffly. "We understand there's been a great deal of tension this week, and we thought it best to invite a voice that matters to Ridgeway." He gestured toward the folding chair in the front row. Gloria stood slowly. She wasn't dressed for television, no makeup, no perfect blazer, just a soft blue cardigan and the floral scarf she had worn the day it all began. She stepped forward, notebook in hand, but didn't open it. She didn't need notes for this. The room quieted, expectant, uneasy. When she spoke, it wasn't loud, but it carried. "I did not come here tonight for your pity," she began, voice steady as stone. "And I didn't come for your outrage either. I came because silence is what lets these things grow." A hush swept across the room. She paused, letting the weight of the moment settle on their shoulders. "What happened to me in that café was not the first injustice in Ridgeway. And if we're honest, it won't be the last. Not unless we finally choose to see it." A murmur stirred at the back of the room. She kept going. "I was humiliated, but I will not be ashamed." She looked directly at the barista from the café, whose eyes filled with tears. Then at Jaden, sitting by the wall, phone resting silently in his lap. "You didn't have to film what you saw, but you did. And because you did, the world listened." Her gaze swept across the room. "To those of you who stayed silent when this happened, you still have a choice. Use your voice now. Use your courage now, before someone else is standing where I stood." The room fell quiet. And in that stillness, the ground shifted. Not loudly, not violently, but deeply. A woman near the back rose, wiping her eyes. Then a teacher stood. Then a mechanic. No one applauded. They just stood. And in their silence, Gloria smiled faintly. This was never about noise. It was about presence. About refusing to look away. Afterward, reporters rushed to catch her on the sidewalk, but Gloria didn't stop for them. She walked home alone, scarf tucked against the wind, heart heavy but proud. And inside the church basement, Marcus Hall watched his mother disappear into the night, a quiet giant in worn sneakers. He didn't follow. He didn't need to. She had already taught him everything he needed to know. He turned to the gathering and spoke softly. "This isn't over," he said. And Ridgeway finally believed it. Because for the first time in a long time, the silence had cracked. And through it, truth was beginning to rise. It happened at 2:14 men, long after the last shift had gone home, long after the streets of Ridgeway had quieted beneath the weight of the week's storms. The east wing of the police department flickered once, twice, then went dark. Server lights blinked out like dying stars. By the time the IT supervisor arrived an hour later, nearly half of the department's internal complaint archive was inaccessible. Entire case files, use of force reports, and personnel logs, temporarily erased, some corrupted beyond immediate recovery. Marcus arrived at dawn, coffee in hand, pulse steady but cold. Cole met him in the server room, face tight with exhaustion. "It wasn't a power surge," she said, voice clipped. "Someone went in, someone with admin clearance. They wiped the archived complaints folder and rerouted the backups. Whoever did this knew exactly where to hit." Marcus closed his eyes briefly, anger tightening in his chest. Much did we lose? Temporarily? Everything from 2014 to 2021. Permanently? Too early to tell. He ran a hand over his face, the weight of the last few days pressing down harder than ever. "They're not even trying to hide it anymore," he said. Cole nodded. "They're trying to burn the evidence before you can use it." He straightened, resolve cutting through fatigue. "Then we recover it, all of it." They worked side by side for the next 12 hours. No speeches, no headlines, just sweat and code and stubbornness. Marcus combed through fragments of old email chains. Cole rebuilt file structures line by painstaking line. They called in a forensic analyst from the state capitol, a woman named Dr. Elena Park, who didn't ask questions. She plugged in her laptop, took one look at the mess, and simply said, "I've seen worse." Together they pulled fragments from corrupted drives, recovered redacted complaints, restored deleted memos. By nightfall, the core data was safe, but the message was clear. Someone in that building wasn't just resisting the audit. They were actively destroying the truth. Marcus leaned against the server rack, exhaustion pulling at his bones. He knew what this meant. The fight wasn't just out in the streets. It was behind his own walls. And until he rooted it out, no reform would last. No truth would survive. While Marcus and Cole battled corrupted files inside-outside Ridgeway, refused to fall silent. The rain came down steady, soaking the courthouse steps where the community still gathered each morning. They stood there without speeches, without banners. Among them stood children holding umbrellas too large for their shoulders, grandmothers wrapped in clear ponchos, and teachers wiping rain from their glasses. And then, near the front of the line, a boy stepped forward. No older than 7. Dark curls plastered to his forehead, blue jacket zipped to his chin. He approached Marcus as the chief stepped outside for a breath of air. The boy held up a drawing, crayon lines scrawled across wrinkled paper. A picture of a shield with the word "Protect Us" written in crooked, hopeful letters. Marcus crouched down, the rain dripping from his coat. "What's your name, kid?" he asked gently. "Eli," the boy whispered. "Thanks," Ellie, Marcus said, voice tight. "I'll do my best." The boy smiled, shy but sure, then ran back to his mother, who mouthed a quiet "thank you" before pulling him into the safety of her coat. Marcus stood, heart heavier and lighter at the same time. He slipped the drawing into his pocket, a fragile reminder of who this fight was really for. But inside the department, betrayal was waiting. That afternoon, Cole stormed into Marcus's office, laptop open in her hands. "We found it," she said sharply. She played back an internal chat log, traced to an encrypted server outside the department's network. The sender was clear: Captain Harlan. He had leaked confidential audit discussions to a local reporter, spinning them as reckless witch hunts. Messages revealed his coordination with the union leadership, his deliberate sabotage of Marcus's reform efforts, and, most damning, his authorization of the server shutdown under the guise of routine maintenance. Marcus stared at the screen, fury quiet but burning. "Call him in," he said. Minutes later, Harlan swaggered into the room, smug, confident. "Chief, heard there was a tech glitch this morning. Lucky we've got backups. Huh?" Marcus didn't smile. He turned the laptop toward him. "Your backups were sabotage, Captain." The room chilled. "You leaked internal documents, undermined an active investigation, and endangered this entire department's credibility." Harlan's smirk faded. "I did what was necessary to protect this house from your crusade." Marcus stood, taller than the anger in the room. "You protected a broken system, not this house." He picked up a suspension notice already drafted and waiting. "Effective immediately. You are suspended pending termination review." For a moment, Harlan looked ready to fight, but then he saw it, the resolve in Marcus's eyes, and knew the battle was over. He left without a word. And when the door clicked shut behind him, Marcus exhaled slowly, alone but unwavering. One enemy down, but too many still standing. That night, Marcus Hall sat alone in his office, long after the lights in the rest of the precinct had gone dark. Outside his window, the rain softened to a drizzle, tapping against the glass like quiet reminders of everything he couldn't control. The building felt emptier now, not because people weren't there, but because trust wasn't. He could feel the gaps in the walls, the silences that weren't just tired, but watchful. Every step down the hall, every closed door, carried the weight of suspicion. He used to know this department, used to laugh with them over stale coffee, swap stories in the briefing room, share quiet prayers before night shifts. But now, those same men and women who once called him chief with pride, called him other things behind his back. Traitor, radical, divider. Even some friends outside the badge had gone quiet. The invitations to backyard barbecues stopped coming. The casual handshakes at the market faded into cold nods. He wasn't blind to it. People liked heroes when they kept quiet, stayed polite, didn't make things messy, but call out the rot inside your own house, and suddenly you are the enemy. He pulled the crayon drawing from his pocket, Eli's shield with the words, "Protect Us," scribbled across the top. The lines weren't straight. The colors bled outside the shapes, but it was perfect. Because that's what this job was supposed to mean. Actions. Not power. Not silence. Not comfort. But tonight, all Marcus felt was tired. He leaned back in his chair, letting his head rest against the worn leather. He thought of Gloria, of how she carried her dignity without needing anyone's permission, how she stood in that café, drenched in coffee and surrounded by cowards, and never once lowered her gaze. And yet, part of him wondered if it was enough. Was any of this enough? The reforms, the suspensions, the speeches, they didn't erase what had been done. They didn't mend trust overnight, and they certainly didn't change the hearts of the men who still waited for him to fail. The phone buzzed on his desk, breaking the quiet. A text from Cole. "We salvaged most of the archives, but it's worse than we thought." Marcus typed back, his fingers heavy on the keys. "How much worse?" A reply came fast. "Multiple complaints tied to senior staff. Some new, some covered it up. It goes back years, Chief." Marcus closed his eyes. Years. This wasn't a wound, it was a disease. And if they didn't cut it out, Ridgeway would never heal. He stood, grabbing his coat, slipping Eli's drawing into the breast pocket where his badge used to rest lighter. Before he turned off the light, he paused. The quiet wasn't comforting anymore. It was heavy, but it was honest. And maybe that was enough for now. He stepped out into the rain, letting it wash over his shoulders as he crossed the dark parking lot. Somewhere behind him, the cracks in the walls groaned softly. But in the distance, down by the courthouse steps, the outline of coffee cups still lined the stone. Waiting, watching, and reminding him why he couldn't quit. Not yet. Tomorrow, the fight would start again. And when it did, he'd be ready. The town hall meeting was standing room only. Reporters lined the back walls, their cameras aimed at the small wooden podium at the front. Ridgeway's residents filled every seat, their faces tense, waiting for the next voice to break the silence. And then Jasmine Carter stepped forward. She wasn't famous, she wasn't powerful, just a 24-year-old woman with trembling hands and a voice that refused to stay quiet any longer. She took a shaky breath, unfolding a worn piece of paper in her hands. "Name is Jasmine Carter," she began, her voice thin but rising with every word. "When I was 15 years old, I was pulled over on a back road outside Ridgeway. My brother was driving. We weren't speeding, we weren't causing trouble, but it didn't matter." The room held its breath. Two officers stopped us, Deputy Rollins and Corporal Creel. They dragged my brother out of the car, slammed him against the hood, and handcuffed him, while I screamed for them to stop. Then they turned on me. Her voice cracked, but she kept going. "I remember how the gravel felt when they pushed me down. I remember the cold air, the smell of gun oil on their belts. I remember thinking I was going to die before anyone ever knew my name." A tear slid down her cheek, but she wiped it away with the back of her sleeve. I filed a report saying we resisted arrest, said my brother was combative, that I attacked an officer. None of it was true, but no one listened to two scared black kids on the side of the road. The room was still. Until now. She looked directly at Marcus, who sat in the front row, shoulders square, eyes steady. Chief Hall listened. For the first time in 9 years, someone in uniform believed me. She folded the paper and placed it on the podium. "I don't know what happens next, but I know this. Silence didn't protect me then, and it won't protect anyone now." The room rose to its feet, slowly at first, then all at once. They didn't cheer. They stood. Because some truths aren't meant to be clapped for. They're meant to be carried. And tonight, Ridgeway carried hers. By morning, Jasmine's testimony was everywhere. A local activist uploaded the full video of her speech to social media. Within hours, it hit 100,000 views. By noon, it crossed 1 million. The hashtag that started it all, Coffee Cop, now had a new companion, Justice for Jasmine. Celebrities shared the clip with captions like, "How many more Jasmines have to suffer before we change?" National civil rights leaders praised Marcus Hall's courage. Political commentators debated it on primetime news. Some called it necessary, Others called it dangerous. But no one could ignore it. Marcus watched it all unfold from his office window, his reflection fractured by the glass. The no-confidence vote was scheduled for Friday. He knew what the outcome would be. The union had spent days whispering in corners, counting votes, stacking the deck against him. He didn't care. He hadn't come this far to protect a title. He had come this far to protect the truth. The mayor called for a meeting that afternoon. Her voice was tight, controlled, balancing support and political caution like a sword on a string. "You forced this town to look in the mirror, Marcus. I respect that. But they're coming for your job. You won't survive the vote." Marcus folded his hands calmly on the table. "Leadership costs me my job, so be it. Silence costs lives." The mayor sighed. "You are a good man in a bad storm." "A man standing where too many have fallen," he replied. She paused. "And if they take your badge?" He didn't hesitate. "Then I'll fight without one." For a long time, she said nothing. Then, with a tired smile, she leaned back. "Well, at least you're consistent." That night, Marcus sent a department-wide email. Simple, clear. It read, "Leadership is not a shield, it is a light. If you can't carry it, step aside." He knew the vote was coming. He knew the whispers were growing louder. But he also knew that for the first time in years, Ridgeway wasn't sleeping through its own sickness. It was awake. And however messy, however painful, that was worth every scar. Across town, community members lit candles outside the Morning Brew Café. A silent vigil for Gloria. For Jasmine. For every name the department tried to forget. Marcus watched the candlelight from his kitchen window, the night stretching wide and uncertain before him. But somewhere in that darkness, a spark remained. Steady, unwilling to be silenced. While Ridgeway burned with headlines and arguments, Gloria Hall sat by her window, wrapped in a simple shawl, watching the morning unfold. She didn't need the internet to tell her the world was changing. She could feel it in the footsteps passing by her house, some hurried, some hesitant, some stopping for just a moment to leave a cup of coffee on her porch railing in quiet solidarity. She smiled softly at the sight. Not because the battle was won, but because the battle was finally seen. The Morning Brew Café, where this all began, had reopened its doors, but Gloria hadn't returned yet. She wasn't ready for the stares, the questions, the weight of people's pity. She didn't need their pity. What she needed was what she saw growing outside her window, a town no longer pretending its problems didn't exist. From her chair, she could see the courthouse steps lined with fresh coffee cups, could see the protesters arriving one by one, some with signs, others with only their presence. Could see the small shifts in her town's heartbeat. And she knew something most of them hadn't realized yet. This fight didn't start with Marcus's speech. It didn't start with Jasmine's tears. It didn't even start with coffee spilled across her chest. It started long before, in quiet kitchens and worn church pews, in whispered warnings from elders to the young. Be careful, stay polite, don't make waves. And for years, she obeyed those whispers. Until that morning. Until that chair. Until that cup. She hadn't raised her voice when Rollins poured that coffee on her. But the world heard her anyway. And now, the world wouldn't stop listening. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. Dozens of missed calls from journalists, activists, strangers who wanted to tell her she was brave, who wanted to turn her story into a symbol. She let them ring. Symbols fade. Stories endure. Instead, she turned her attention to the porch, where a young girl stood, no older than 10, placing a handmade sign on the railing. It read in shaky letters, "Thank you for being strong." Gloria tapped the window gently, drawing the girl's gaze. And then, with a small wave, she smiled. Not the smile of someone finished fighting, but the smile of someone who knows the fight no longer rests on her shoulders alone. Behind her, a framed photo of Marcus in his academy uniform sat on the bookshelf. She remembered the day it was taken. How proud she'd been. How scared, too. But today, as the sun broke through the clouds and lit the faces of those standing for justice, she felt something else. Peace. Because for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. The weight of silence no longer rested on her shoulders. It rested on a town that had finally learned to carry it together. And that, she thought, was the beginning of victory. Not loud, not easy, but real. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of voices rising, not in anger, but in promise. And Gloria Hall closed her eyes, letting it carry her forward into whatever came next. The next morning, an envelope slid under Marcus Hall's office door. No return address, no note, just a manila folder with a single sheet of paper and a USB drive inside. Marcus opened it carefully. On the paper, a name he already feared would appear. Corporal Daniel Creel, one of Ridgeway's longest-serving officers. Decorated, respected, the man who trained half the department's senior staff. The same man Marcus once considered a mentor. Attached were 3 complaints. All filed, all quietly dismissed. The USB drive contained body cam footage Creel had failed to log in the department's official system. Footage from 3 years ago, on a cold November night. It showed a young black father pulled over for a broken taillight. It showed Creel pulling him from the car without cause. It showed the man's daughter, no older than 5, crying in the back seat, begging him not to hurt her daddy. It showed a department built on cruelty masked as procedure. Marcus felt the sickness rise in his throat. Creel wasn't just part of the system. He was the architect of its silence. Marcus called Creel into his office. Creel walked in calm, confident, his uniform pressed, badge polished. "Chief," he said, tipping his head like nothing had changed. Marcus slid the file across the desk. "Explain this." Creel glanced at the footage, barely flinching. "Situational compliance," he said flatly. "Officer discretion." Marcus leaned forward, voice low and cold. There was discretion. That was abuse. Creel crossed his arms, unfazed. "Do you really think this town wants you tearing down its heroes?" Marcus stood, taller than the weight pressing down on the room. "I'm not tearing down heroes. I'm exposing cowards who wore the uniform to hide their hate." For the first time, Creel's expression cracked. He wasn't used to being challenged. Marcus placed a suspension notice on the desk. Effective immediately, pending external review. Creel stared at him, years of unchallenged power slipping through his fingers. "You're going to regret this, Hall." Marcus met his gaze without blinking. "No, I regret not doing it sooner." Creel left without another word. And outside that office, Ridgeway's walls shook again. Because now, even its untouchables were falling. The news of Creel's suspension hit the state capitol by sunset. By morning, a formal letter arrived on Marcus's desk, bearing the seal of the State Department of Public Safety. Subject: immediate oversight inquiry into the Ridgeway Police Department. They were sending a task force, not to investigate Creel, but to investigate Marcus. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent weeks exposing corruption, and now the state wanted to know if his actions were appropriate, and within the ethical framework of his office. Cole stood beside him, reading the letter over his shoulder. Sloane nodded, regarding her with under investigation for investigating them. Marcus smiled thinly. Welcome to reform. By Friday, the State Oversight Board arrived in Ridgeway, 4 officials in pressed suits with clipboards and questions sharper than knives. They sat up in the courthouse, holding formal hearings. Witnesses were called. Records were reviewed. And in the middle of it all stood Marcus Hall, summoned to testify before a crowd of reporters, state officials, and Ridgeway residents packed shoulder to shoulder in the old courtroom. He took a seat beneath the fluorescent lights, adjusted the microphone, and began. My name is Marcus Hall. I am the chief of police for Ridgeway, but before that, I was the son of Gloria Hall. I watched my mother sit in silence for years, enduring the small humiliations people justified as the way things are. And then one morning she walked into a café and became a headline, not because she raised her voice, but because a man in uniform forgot her humanity. The room was silent, hanging on his words. This isn't about one officer. This isn't about me. It's about a system where silence was easier than truth. Years. Complaints were dismissed. Evidence was buried. Victims were ignored. And good officers were told to keep their heads down and their mouths shut. He looked each board member in the eye. I chose not to. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A board member cleared her throat. Chief Hall, are you suggesting that your actions, releasing names publicly, suspending senior staff, were necessary to restore public trust? Marcus didn't flinch. No, I'm saying they were the bare minimum. The room stilled. He continued, leadership isn't measured by how many friends you keep in power. It's measured by how many lies you're willing to confront when the cost is your own peace. Another board member leaned forward. Chief Hall, do you believe your reforms have created division within your department? He nodded slowly. Yes, but that division was already there. I just refused to pretend it wasn't. The words landed like thunder in the quiet room. Marcus paused, his voice softer but no less certain. I didn't tear this house down. I tore the curtains back so we could see what was rotting inside. He stood then, his badge catching the light. If that costs me my title, then so be it. But at least my daughter will know I stood for something more than silence. And with that he sat down, the courtroom holding its breath, unsure whether it had just witnessed a resignation speech or the beginning of something bigger. Outside, the crowds pressed against the courthouse steps, waiting for the next move. But inside, the first cracks in the old guard's armor had already begun to split wide open. The following day, the State Oversight Board opened its public comment period, expecting a handful of speakers, maybe a few angry residents. Instead, Ridgeway showed up in full force. The line stretched down the courthouse steps and wrapped around the block. Parents with children on their hips, teachers in rain-soaked jackets, store owners, nurses, pastors, and teenagers with worn sneakers and defiant eyes. One by one, they stepped up to the microphone. My name is Lorraine White. My grandson was stopped walking home from school. No charges, no apology. I'm Pastor Daniels. I buried 3 young men before they turned 25. All victims of police violence swept under the rug. I'm Maria Lopez. They raided my home looking for someone who didn't live there. My kids still won't sleep without the lights on. For hours, the stories poured in. No speeches. No theatrics. Truth. Unpolished, raw, undeniable truth. And as each voice rose, the old guard's narrative crumbled further. The idea that Marcus Hall was a rogue chief acting alone no longer held weight. This wasn't his fight anymore. It was theirs. One woman, thin and tired, stood at the microphone and held up a faded photo of her brother. This man was stopped in 2009. He never made it home. His case file disappeared. She paused, voice shaking but steady. "We didn't." The board members shifted in their seats, their polished shoes suddenly too small to stand in this truth. Reporters scribbled furiously, their headlines writing themselves. Even some of the officers watching from the back of the room lowered their heads, shame heavy on their shoulders. But through it all, Marcus sat quietly, hands folded, listening. Not leading. Listening. Because this was what leadership looked like when ego stepped aside. It looked like giving the microphone to the unheard. It looked like sitting in your own discomfort while the truth you'd ignored found its voice. And outside the courthouse, where the morning light finally broke through the clouds, Ridgeway changed. Not with banners or bullets, but with voices. Voices that refused to be silenced again. When the last speaker finished, the room didn't erupt in applause. It fell into a quiet deeper than any silence before. Because everyone knew something had shifted. Permanently. The board adjourned for deliberation, but the verdict wasn't theirs alone anymore. It belonged to Ridgeway. And Ridgeway was done pretending it didn't know. That night, as the courthouse emptied and the streets quieted, Marcus walked home alone. No cameras. No crowds. Just the faint sound of wind carrying a single, undeniable truth. The reckoning had only just begun. But it would not stop here. It wasn't healed. But it was no longer sleeping through its vote took place on a gray Tuesday morning. The Ridgeway Police Department's briefing room, once filled with chatter and easy laughter, was now quiet enough to hear the clock ticking on the wall. Officers sat in folding chairs, their faces drawn, their loyalties already counted in private corners, long before the meeting began. At the front of the room, the union president stood stiffly, reading from a prepared statement. "We are here today to decide whether Chief Marcus Hall continues to lead this department. This is not personal. This is about stability, unity, and the future of Ridgeway law enforcement." But everyone in the room knew it was personal. Marcus sat alone near the front, his back straight, his face calm. He had already made peace with whatever the outcome would be. He knew some of these men and women had turned against him. But he also knew others had found their courage. The vote was cast anonymously, paper ballots dropped into a rusted metal box. Cole collected them without speaking, her jaw tight. Officer Reynolds stood beside her, his shoulders squared against the weight of what came next. When the count was finished, Cole whispered the results into Marcus's ear. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the moment wash over him. The union president cleared his throat, the room holding its breath. "The motion to remove Chief Hall has failed. The department will remain under his leadership." The words hung in the air like thunder. Some officers exhaled in relief. Others clenched their jaws in quiet anger. A few stood and walked out, their loyalty no longer hidden. But what mattered was this. For the first time, the reformers outnumbered the old guard. It wasn't a landslide. It wasn't a revolution. But it was enough. Marcus stood slowly, scanning the room, his voice steady. "This vote doesn't end anything. It begins something. We clean this house now, or we lose it forever." Some nodded. Some turned away. But they all knew the tide had turned, and Ridgeway's future was no longer theirs to protect alone. It belonged to the people they had sworn to serve. The old chains hadn't broken all at once, but they were breaking. And Marcus Hall stood ready to finish the job. The next morning, Marcus Hall did something no chief in Ridgeway's history had ever done. He handed power to the people. Standing outside the precinct steps, in front of reporters and residents holding coffee cups and protest signs, he announced the formation of Ridgeway's first Revillion Review Board. Composed of teachers, pastors, students, small business owners, people who had lived the department's failures firsthand. They would review all use of force cases. They would have access to officer complaints. And for the first time, the department's mistakes would no longer be judged behind closed doors. They would be judged by the people it swore to protect. There was no applause, just a heavy silence, followed by slow, steady nods from the crowd. This was what transparency looked like. Easy, unfinished, but real. Later that evening, as the sun slipped beneath Ridgeway's horizon, Marcus found himself on his mother's porch, the same porch where he had learned right from wrong, truth from convenience. Gloria sat beside him, a blanket across her lap, a warm cup of tea in her hands. For a while they said nothing. Just watched the quiet street, where families walked their dogs and porch lights blinked on one by one. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "Did I do the right thing, Ma?" Gloria sipped her tea, thinking. "You did the hard thing," she said softly, "and sometimes that's the same as the right thing." He let her words settle in his bones. "I thought cleaning the house would feel better than this, but it just feels lonely." She smiled faintly, eyes fixed on the fading sky. "Justice is loud when it starts, baby, but it's quiet when it lasts. You won't hear the change all the time. You'll feel it, though, in the places where people finally stop looking over their shoulders." Marcus nodded, the weight in his chest softening but not disappearing. "Think they'll forgive me?" he asked. Gloria shook her head gently. "You're not here for their forgiveness, Marcus. You're here for their protection." The street fell quiet again, the wind carrying the soft laughter of children playing 2 doors down. And for the first time in days, Marcus let himself breathe. Not because the fight was over, but because, for once, he wasn't fighting alone. He looked out at Ridgeway and knew the road ahead was still long. But it finally had enough light to see the way forward. Weeks later, Ridgeway woke to the sight of color blooming across its cracked brick walls. Artists, young and old, had taken to the streets with brushes and spray cans, turning the scars of the town into reminders of what it had survived. On the west side of Main Street, across from the Morning Brew Café, the first mural appeared. It showed Gloria Hall seated in the second booth by the window, her floral scarf gently draped across her shoulders, a steaming cup of coffee before her, and her gaze steady, looking out at the world that had once tried to ignore her. Above her image, in bold letters, the words read. He never raised her voice, the world did it for her. People gathered in front of it in the early morning hours. Some left flowers. Others left notes. A few simply stood in silence, letting the weight of those words settle into their bones. The mural wasn't the only one. Across from the police precinct, another wall bore Marcus Hall's silhouette, not as a chief, but as a man standing with his hands at his sides, facing a storm of headlines and shadows. Underneath it read, "Courage isn't loud, it's constant." But for Marcus, the truest legacy was not painted on the walls, but written in the faces of the people he passed each morning. The cashier who once averted his eyes now offered a quiet nod. The teacher whose students had once been warned to stay small now taught a class on civic responsibility. The officers who remained after the storm weren't perfect, but they were present, and they were learning. And Ridgeway, for all its broken pieces, was awake. Own sickness. Marcus still faced opposition. Angry letters still landed on his desk. Anonymous threats still slid under his door. But so did thank you notes from strangers. So did crayon drawings from children who now saw police as protectors, not predators. And in the early morning light, when the world was quiet, he saw the difference most clearly. He saw it in Gloria, sitting by her window, watching the town she once thought had forgotten her. She smiled softly, not because everything was fixed, but because finally, people were willing to try. And that, Marcus knew, was enough to keep going. He stood one morning outside the precinct, watching as another group of volunteers touched up the mural. A young girl approached him, no older than 10, clutching a notebook to her chest. "Chief Hall?" she asked, her voice small but steady. "Ma'am," he replied, crouching to her level. "Will the bad cops ever come back?" He paused, considering his words carefully. "Maybe," he said honestly, "but if they do, Ridgeway will be ready for them." She smiled, scribbled something in her notebook, and ran back to her friends. Marcus stood, the morning sun finally breaking through the clouds, warming his shoulders. For the first time in a long time, Ridgeway wasn't waiting for a hero. It had found its voice. And as long as it kept using it, justice wouldn't fade back into silence. It would grow louder with every story told, every wrong made right, and every person who refused to look away. The chains had broken, and in their place, something stronger was being built. Not perfect, but possible. And for Marcus Hall, that was enough. The morning after the public forum, when most of Ridgeway was still quiet, a new envelope arrived on Marcus Hall's desk. No address, no sender, just a plain manila folder with a weight heavier than paper alone. Marcus stared at it for a long moment before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a USB drive. The paper said only this: "Ridgeway was never the whole story. Look deeper." He slid the USB into his computer, his pulse steady but tense. The screen filled with files, financial ledgers, email threads, hiring logs, and complaint records. But they weren't from Ridgeway. They were from 3 neighboring towns with similar complaints, similar names, similar cover-ups. Records of complaints dismissed before they saw daylight. Officers quietly transferred instead of discipline. Suspicious settlements marked confidential. What Marcus found wasn't just another case. It was a blueprint. A coordinated system where bad cops were recycled from one small department to the next. Where misconduct didn't end careers, it protected them through silence and favors. The pit in his stomach deepened. He thought Ridgeway was the front line. But it was just a symptom of something much bigger. A system far wider, far older, far more tangled than one town's shame. He sat back, running a tired hand over his face. This wasn't what he signed up for. But it was what he couldn't ignore. Cole knocked gently at the door. "Something wrong?" Marcus turned the screen so she could see. She skimmed the files, her face falling. Neighboring towns? They knew? "They let it," Marcus said quietly. Cole leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "We barely survived Ridgeway. Now you're thinking about widening the fight?" Marcus stared out the window, watching a group of school kids crossing the street with their parents. How many more towns are letting kids grow up afraid of the badge? Cole sighed, rubbing her temples. "Supply." "We keep going," Marcus said, voice steady, "because if we stop now, we were never serious in the first place." Cole nodded slowly, the weight of exhaustion and duty shared between them. "Then let's start pulling the threads." And just like that, the next battle began. No press conference. No headlines. Just 2 officers staring down a system that had thrived in darkness for far too long. They didn't know what they'd find beyond Ridgeway. But they knew this: silence wasn't safety. It was complicity. And they weren't silent anymore. While Marcus and Cole prepared to widen the investigation, Ridgeway began writing a new story of its own. It started quietly, with the Morning Brew Café. The second booth on the left, where Gloria Hall once sat in silence, had become something more. A symbol, a sanctuary, a place where silence was no longer accepted as peace. Each Wednesday morning, without invitation or formality, the townspeople gathered. Not just activists or officers, not just the young or the old, everyone. The baristas pushed tables together. The regulars gave up their favorite seats. People spoke of what they'd seen, what they'd endured, and what they still feared. They didn't always agree, but they listened. And in a town where listening used to be the rarest form of courage, that mattered. Students shared their dreams for a police force that protected them, not profiled them. Single mothers told stories of traffic stops that turned into terror. Young officer, some new, some uncertain, stood and spoke about their fear of speaking out, of being silenced by the very brotherhood sworn to protect the truth. And in the back of the café, Gloria Hall listened. She never spoke first. She didn't need to. Her quiet presence said enough. But one crisp autumn morning, as the leaves turned brittle and golden outside the café windows, she rose from her chair. The room stilled. She placed her hands on the edge of the table and spoke in a voice soft but sure. "I came here every week for years and no one noticed me, until a cup of coffee hit my chest. But I was always here, like so many others who sit quietly because they think their stories don't matter." Her eyes swept across the room, landing on faces both familiar and new. "Oh, stories do matter. Silence doesn't protect peace. It protects power. And I won't sit quiet anymore." The cafe filled with nods, tears, and quiet resolve. No applause. Just understanding. Across town, murals of Gloria began appearing. On brick walls. On the backs of alleyways. In the corners of schoolyards. Always the same image. Her at the cafe table, coffee cup in hand, eyes steady. Beneath the words, "He never raised her voice. The world did it for her." Even the police station changed. The old plaque that once read "Serve and Protect" was joined by a new one beside it, carved from steel. He asked, "Hair and defend." But for Marcus, the change was clearest in the small moments. In the way a rookie officer stopped by the community forum, cap in hand, ready to learn instead of command. In the way a grandmother on Willow Street waved to patrol cars without lowering her gaze. In the way Ridgeway breathed easier, not because the fight was over, but because it was shared. One evening, as Marcus walked home from a late meeting, a little girl stopped him on the corner. Same girl from before. Blue coat, wide eyes, notebook clutched to her chest. She asked, tilting her head. "Yes, ma'am." "Did you win?" Marcus knelt down, the weight of weeks settling quietly in his shoulders. He smiled softly, honest. "No. I made sure they didn't win either." She frowned thoughtfully, considering his answer. Then she smiled, bright and sure. "Good enough," she said. And then she ran ahead, her laughter rising through the night like wind through the leaves. Marcus stood, watching her disappear down the sidewalk. Maybe she was right. Maybe that was enough for today. But tomorrow there'd be another fight. And the day after that. And he would be there for all of them. Not because he was a hero, but because he refused to be silent. Not ever again. That night, alone in his office, Marcus Hall sat before his computer, the blue glow of the screen reflecting the weight of the day. The town was quiet, but his mind was anything but. The files from the USB drive sat waiting in a folder labeled simply "Next." And in the silence, Marcus knew the work wasn't done. He opened the department's public statement portal, the same page he had once feared would be filled with lies. He placed his fingers on the keyboard and typed, slowly at first, then steadily. To anyone who has ever felt unseen, I see you. He paused, reading the words aloud in the empty room. The voice that was silenced before it could rise, I hear you. The cursor blinked, waiting. To anyone wearing a badge who forgot what it stands for, let me remind you, it stands for service, not silence. And then, the words that mattered most. This is not the end. It's the beginning. He read it once. Then again. And then he hit publish. The message spread faster than he imagined. Within hours, it was painted on the side of the community center, printed on the backs of coffee shop menu, whispered between students walking home from school. It was no longer just Marcus Hall's promise. It was Ridgeway's. And as the sun rose the next morning, casting gold across the mural of Gloria Hall's quiet defiance, the town took its next breath, stronger than the last. Marcus stood on the precinct steps, coffee in hand, watching the streets stir to life. He knew another fight would come. He knew somewhere beyond Ridgeway, another badge was being used the wrong way. But today, Ridgeway was awake. And awake towns don't go back to sleep. He slipped his hands into his pockets, smiled faintly, and whispered to himself, "Let's begin again." And so they did. Not perfectly. Not painlessly. But together. And that was enough. For now. And when the silence tried to return, Ridgeway would raise its voice again. Louder. Stronger. Unbroken.